So I'm here at the EEA conference with Duncan Botting from the Institution of Engineering and Technology out from Europe, a keynote speaker at this year's EEA event. Duncan, you painted a very interesting picture around the challenges facing utilities. Can you just recap and explain what is facing utilities in Europe at the moment?
Yeah, surely. Basically in Europe we've had a very large driver from the 2020 renewables and energy efficiency environment. So this is stemmed from Kyoto and the drivers there, but this has now been enshrined in law and mandated, so we have a legal requirement to meet these targets by 2020, and also there's targets for 2050 beyond that. Basically the utilities are operating in almost a perfect storm environment. We actually signed up to many of these sorts of agreements in times of good times. Now we have quite a lot of fallout from the fiscal issues of 2008 and the austerity programs which are actually being put in place around Europe. So in terms of the utilities, they have a huge amount of ageing infrastructure. They've also got a large amount of expenditure to put in place for things like the renewables that they need to buy. So it's a real challenge for them in trying to understand how all of these aspects will come together. Added to that, there's a requirement because of the generation in place. There's an intermittency problem which is becoming quite an issue, and to try and offset that, they've tried to bring the demand side into more of the picture. So smart metering is being mandated and rolling out around Europe. Around 440 million metres will be rolled out. In the UK, that's equating to around about 40 million electricity meters, which has something in the region of about £12.5 billion worth of investment behind it. So these are not small sums. So all of these activities are providing them with a major challenge as to how the system itself needs to be optimised and rethought. Maybe here in New Zealand it's not quite the same picture, therefore you don't have the same issues with intermittency because of the hydro and the geothermal. But obviously the demand side will be a major issue here. So I can see things like EVs or hydrogen being an issue for New Zealand as well.
It's interesting you mentioned that there's a real cultural challenge facing power companies, and I suppose governments that are writing energy policy as well. Can you explain what that is?
Well, the cultural issues are one of the mandated rollout of smart meters across the world has had varying sort of interactions with how the general public has accepted them. A lot of people see it as a spy in the house, and others see it as an opportunity to actually reduce their electricity bills. So there's a real dynamic. In terms of all the cultural different aspects, most of the electricity industry is actually coming up against the public for things like transmission poles in their back garden, or infrastructure which is creating their visual amenity and reducing the value of their homes, etc. So in terms of the cultural aspect, it's probably the hardest of all of the issues that we're dealing with, and I think we still have some way to go on that.
You mentioned the austerity measures. What impact is the current financial situation in Europe having on some of those previously ambitious targets in the renewables space around feed-in tariffs, deployment of solar and wind? What impact is the current financial climate having on that space?
Well, obviously there's an issue of prioritisation of funding in Europe now, and we are still moving forward, but probably at a slower pace than we were. Things like the feed-in tariffs in UK and Spain, they're all being cut back to residential users. We're seeing the energy market reforms, or electricity market reforms, being put in place to provide some certainty for investors to actually invest in some of this infrastructure. So yeah, there's been an impact, but there's still the mandated targets to achieve.
Perhaps a lesson for New Zealand in the impermanence of subsidies and the investment that you can launch into there.
Well, I think it all depends on what society wants, and we're in a global community, and there's a whole range of different impacts for different communities. So I suspect that no silver bullet exists for each and every community.
Globally, you mentioned that we're heading into a world where we're going to have 9 billion people, and 80% of those people living in cities. What challenge does that pose for utilities?
Well, we're certainly seeing now that instead of just smart grids being just the electricity grids, there's smart intelligent energy systems being considered, because cities have a major problem now with actually bringing together things like heating and cooling, transport, water, ICT. All of these different grids have a role to play, and if we duplicate, it could become very costly in those cities. So cities will probably be the driver of a lot of the ideas that we've been talking about this week.
In the renewables space, are you able to give us an idea around what you're seeing and the costs of solar and wind in Europe, and those general sort of trends that I suppose have trickle-down effects for New Zealand?
Without a doubt, the solar is pretty much heading towards grid parity, which is the cost where it becomes viable as a commercial entity on its own without subsidy. I think other technologies are not so mature and need some investment. Things like wind, offshore wind especially in UK is an issue where there's a big debate on how much we can actually afford in terms of subsidy for this area.
Well, Duncan, thanks very much for your time. One last question is, I mean, you've painted a real challenge facing Europe particularly, and I think it's one that will be replicated around the world as financially things get tighter and tighter. Do you think that the grid can cope, that distribution systems can cope?
I wouldn't be here unless I felt that there was hope. Basically, I believe engineers are going to be a great part of the solution in bringing optimal options for the future, and that's the key, is providing flexibility and not just designing for one outcome.
So optionality, very important.
Absolutely. If we just provide for possibly lowest cost, it could end up in tears, because other options may not be so easy to recover in the future.
Duncan, thanks very much for your time. I hope you enjoyed your stay in New Zealand.
Thanks very much.